So, it's my great pleasure to introduce Heidy Meriste from the University of Tartu. We met Heidy while we were working in Tartu in the summer, and we thought straight away that she would be a perfect fit for this seminar series. And so, yes, without further ado, I'd like to give her the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm very glad to see you all here. And today I want to talk to you about non-retrospective guilt. So I want to go really beyond retrospective guilt, which is how I think that people normally think about guilt. They think about retrospective instances of guilt. So here I have just a few examples of this very common conception of retrospective guilt. Case of Lady Macbeth, for example, who is driven into madness because she had encouraged her husband to kill King Duncan, but later, of course, she doesn't feel so good about it. Also Oedipus, who is devastated by the fact that he has killed his father and his mother, and wed his mother, sorry. And also brought about a disaster to his city. Here too we have an instance of retrospective guilt. And also notice that both are cases where the person feels that he or she would like to take back what has been done, right? So it's like they would like to undo the deed. And these cases also, they're characterized by this really tragic sense of irreversibility. You feel that you can't take it back, but you would like to take it back. You would like to do things differently. And of course, such incidents do make good stories. So I think that it's no surprise that we often hear about these retrospective cases of guilt. But today, as I already said, I want to go beyond those cases. And more precisely, the view that I'm going against is the kind of view that thinks that guilt is always exclusively retrospective. That we can only become to feel guilty after we have committed the deed or the thing about which we feel guilt. And this kind of conception of really exclusively retrospective guilt, it involves the wish to take it back, which accounts for this tragic sense of irreversibility of lived time. And it also accounts for this kind of like puzzlement and perception of a self who committed the immoral deed as alien to oneself. For example, people are often characterized as thinking that, how could I do it? In my right mind, I would not have done so. So there is this kind of so-called emergence of the alien self that you're somewhat like puzzled that how could this happen in the first place? This is the idea of a retrospective guilt, which, as I want to argue, is not the only one. I've got here a reference to one study by Carson and Schuberg, which is actually a qualitative study where they analyzed like lots of interviews about people's experiences of guilt, and then they tried to extract a conception of guilt from those interviews. And they were really like studying the phenomenology of guilt and how these people like describe their experiences. While I don't agree with the authors, I think that their article is very, very fascinating. But what they get out of those stories that people tell them is this kind of conception that they say that, guilt has this really clear temporal unfolding. The moment of guilt feeling occurs after the moment. Well, basically, what they say is that first, you go through the action in a kind of easygoing way. And then a sense of guilt starts to emerge as you realize that the thing you did was really bad, or as you go through a change of heart and you really start to care about the thing. Maybe earlier you didn't care. And then, when you feel this guilt, you reconstruct this past act as a kind of moment of negligence. So their account of guilt is like really exclusively retrospective. You can't feel guilt like while you're doing the action, it always comes in later, and the action earlier is only lived in a more easygoing way. This kind of conception, I mean, it's not only there in their paper. You can also see similar conception when you read more continental accounts or phenomenological accounts of guilt, because it's a common theme that some authors think that guilt is supposed to like break down pride, understanding pride as a kind of like not a very reflective way of living, thinking that you're kind of doing everything all right, and it kind of lacks this kind of self-reflection. So, as already said, I want to defend that it is possible to feel present and future-focused guilt, and I also want to show you that there is also something really unique about those episodes compared to the retrospective guilt. Maybe just to highlight the first point that I want to show, that it's possible, it is going to be beyond the scope of this talk today to defend that it is always also morally appropriate, or like maybe I'm going to present some cases that you don't agree that the person should be feeling guilty, but I will not have the time to defend all those cases, but all I want to show you is that it is credible that some people might feel guilt in those cases. So I'm just defending the possibility of present and future-focused guilt. But I do believe that many of you will, at least in their minds, also agree that this can be appropriate instances. So first, I'm going to start with the definitions of guilt and temporal focus. Then I'm going to tackle with a general obstacle and the way of conceiving those cases. Then I talk more about present-focused guilt, then future-focused guilt. And in the very end, I also want to take a bit of time to go back to this retrospective past-focused guilt and to see what can we learn about this past-focused guilt. Because, I mean, I do agree that a dominant kind of guilt is still a past-focused guilt. But we will revisit it in the end. So, the definitions. When I talk about guilt, first of all, I'm talking about the emotion of guilt. So whereas we might say that the murderer also bears some guilt, which is a more objective state, even though the murderer might not feel guilty, this is not what I am interested in. I am interested in the emotion of guilt, the kind of feeling. Then I take this feeling to arise from three conditions, at least in prototypical cases. So first, there has to be a kind of underlying concern for morality. You need to care about doing the right thing. So you have to value morality, or you have to desire to do the right thing. Then there must be a belief or a belief-like state that the intentional object of guilt exemplifies a moral failure, right? So I tie guilt with moral failures. I will be later talking about cases of guilt for breaking a diet. I don't think that there is any inconsistency there, because I think that those cases when you feel guilt for breaking a diet, you are violating a kind of promise to yourself. You have promised to yourself. So all kinds of non-moral things can become moral matters when there are promises involved. And of course, since it is an emotion, there must be a kind of painful feeling as well. So I take it as self-evident. So yeah, these are the main three components. In many cases, I will later refer back to this concern for morality and the kind of belief which are necessary conditions for guilt to arise. And this will help us understand why sometimes guilt does not arise. The definition of past, present, and future focused, what do I have in mind when I use these words? I take it that an emotion is past, present, or future focused if the intentional object of the emotion is accordingly perceived as located in past, present, future with respect to the phenomenal now. Now, that was a long definition. So what is the intentional object of the emotion? It is that which the emotion is about. You know, I might feel joy or be glad that there is water here, so then like the water being here is the object. But of course, in case of guilt, it's usually the kind of deed or this kind of immoral thing there. Now, why do I have this qualifier, the phenomenal now? This is added because if I simulate a scenario, for example, yeah, I mean, whenever you could like just simulate a scenario, or like let's take a case where I haven't done anything wrong yet, but I'm contemplating doing something wrong. So I'm really vividly simulating myself committing some bad deed, and I'm becoming to feel guilt within this simulated scenario, right? And let's say that I imagine it as a kind of future scenario. Now, I would not want to say that this is future-focused guilt proper, because within this simulated scenario, you still feel past-focused guilt, because you have already played through the scenario and like you feel guilt for what you have done in this scenario. So here I'm not interested in this kind of thing. I want to show you guys that there is really the kind of guilt which you can feel for your future actions, even if you are not simulating them. So this is why I have this phenomenal now here. And just another qualifier, I mean, I don't want to say that all episodes of guilt can be neatly categorized as either past, present, or future focused. I'm totally happy to say that in many cases we have mixed forms of guilt, because many kinds of actions can extend in time. And I mean, I might feel guilt for my present intention and the content of this intention, which is the future deed. So in many cases we can have mixed forms. I'm not against it, but I just want to show that it is possible to have these episodes of guilt that also can have this future-focused aspect and present-focused aspect. So the most general obstacle, why do people not think about those present and future-focused instances of guilt? I think that the most general obstacle is that they think that people who already care about morality would not do morally problematic things. Remember when I showed you the definition of guilt, I showed you there that you have to care about morality. So there is a kind of puzzle that why would someone who cares about morality go on and at the moment commit something bad or plan to commit something bad? So yeah, some people might think that this might count as a reason why present and future-focused guilt cannot exist. But this would be too hasty to make this kind of generalization, because there are actually, in fact, various reasons why one might go on committing the wrong, even though the person is fully aware that he's committing a wrong and also cares about morality. So the first type of case is weakness of will. So we can imagine those cases where somebody breaks a diet, eats something unhealthy, and I mean, people do not always act upon their long-term desires and goals, so they might just indulge in a kind of more short-term temptation. And of course, guilt you would only have when you have these really lucid cases of weakness of will, when the person is aware that I shouldn't be eating this, or like a case where somebody is maybe cheating on his or her partner, also could be a lucid case of weakness of will, giving into a kind of temporary temptation. Secondly, one can also be torn between plural values and loyalties, and these are now more complicated cases. For example, we could have moral value competing with moral value. This is what we normally see in tragic dilemmas, where, for example, you have to sacrifice something for the greater good. But we can also see these kinds of cases where a moral value is competing with a non-moral value. So, for example, where personal ambitions are taken to outweigh morality. So if you think about Macbeth, not Lady Macbeth anymore, but Macbeth himself, then, I mean, he didn't want to kill King Duncan. I mean, he didn't want to do it, but his ambition outweighed like his morality. So, of course, I'm not making any claims about what Macbeth actually feels in the play, but like in principle, he could feel that like it's the wrong thing to do, but I am going to make this sacrifice because I want. I'm an ambitious man and I want to be a king myself. So, I don't know why the slides disappear all the time. Maybe it's like the character of life, everything like disappears when you don't pay attention to it. So, I think that rather than making these kinds of present and future focused instances of guilt impossible, this kind of tension between like caring about morality and yet still acting against it, it is actually something that makes those instances really interesting, because there is this really peculiar tension there. And in many cases, this tension between caring about doing the right thing and not doing the right thing, well, we can already go to that. It actually exists in a rather fragile balance, which can easily dissolve into either rationalizing the action, because then it's easier to go through with it, or cutting the action off. So this is why in many cases you don't get very long-standing instances of this present and future-focused guilt, because there is this really fragile balance. Yet these cases of lucid weakness of will and cases of pluralism, they give us a reason to also imagine more stable cases where this kind of guilt feeling could linger a bit longer. So yeah, there is this interesting psychological conflict where often also a kind of emotional ambivalence, because if you think about these cases of present-focused guilt, for example, where you indulge in a temptation, then there is a kind of like bittersweetness there. Because on the one hand, I mean, you want to do it and it's kind of sweet, but on the other hand, you don't want to do it. So yeah, sometimes you've also probably heard the word guilty pleasure. So like the guilt and the pleasure are kind of competing there. Not necessarily in all cases, but especially I think in those cases of weakness of will, where you have this competing temptation there, which also brings joy. So I think that this is actually interesting on its own. And also perhaps a point on self-alienation. A philosopher called Gabriel Taylor has actually said that guilt involves a perception of an alien self. I mentioned this alien self a bit earlier as well. So the agent sees himself as a doer of the wicked deed, and so as alien to himself. So, I mean, I think it is easy to say this kind of thing when you are really focused on the retrospective cases. Because in the retrospective cases, you can distance your present self from the past self, right? I mean, you think that now I'm a different kind of person. Now I would not do this kind of thing. So you can still perceive your present self in a more harmonious way as univocally condemning the deed and the past self. Now, this cannot be the case when we think about present or future-focused guilt, because to some extent, at least, you have to identify with the deed because you are at the moment doing it or you are planning to do it. So, yeah, unless we are really dealing with pathological cases, it is, I think, a bit far-fetched to say that there is this, like, totally alien self there. So perhaps we should, like, make more fine-grained degrees there, and this, like, alien self, I'm not sure if it's the best word for all those cases. But I think that it is easy to overemphasize the alien self when we only think about those retrospective cases. Because, yeah, who would want to identify too much with their bad deeds? So yeah, these were a few really interesting points about the types of guilt I want to talk about. And yeah, these were about peculiar tension there, which can result in those bittersweet feelings sometimes, and also this point about self-alienation. But to some extent, yeah, of course, to some extent you are alienated, but to some extent you are not really that alienated. Now let us have a closer look on present-focused guilt. And I think this is easier to defend. And I mean, are there any further obstacles in the way of conceiving present-focused guilt compared to this that I already mentioned, that people find it hard to imagine why people who care about morality go on doing the things? Well, of course, I mean, somebody could say that there's a kind of tension between taking a self-reflective stance, as in case of guilt, and being absorbed in the activity. So, for example, when you're acting on an impulse, it is really easy to lapse into this non-reflective mode. You see this unhealthy food and you just give in to craving, and maybe you don't even think about it. And of course, there might be some kind of actions, like you want to rob a bank, then maybe it's not the best idea for you to take a self-reflective stance, because you need all your full focus on your activity if you really want to succeed with it. So you might want to like suppress it. But of course, none of those cases are like general arguments against the possibility of taking a self-reflective stance, because like even when somebody is, for example, cheating on their partner, even an external clue like looking at your wedding ring could kind of trigger this kind of guilt, that you realize that no, this is not right what I'm doing, and there would still be this kind of bitter sense of guilt accompanying the act. So yeah, I don't see a general reason here why we could not feel guilt for our present actions, because we are not always fully absorbed in the things that we do. I mean, I think that this present-focused guilt is really underestimated, and people have not given due attention to it, especially philosophers. I think that this is mainly because philosophers have been very focused on actions. And in case of actions, which have a rather short duration, the guilt that we feel is normally going to be past-focused, because there's only a very limited time during the act itself that you could feel guilt. And I mean, once you have done the guilty deed, then later, inevitably, your guilt is going to be past-focused. But I think that if you think about different kinds of states, in addition to actions, then this present-focused guilt can become much more visible. So let us think about long-lasting omissions. I mean, they have much longer durations than many actions do. So, for example, and this is I was actually Googling about different instances of guilt, and there was this. It was a bit like random study, and I was not quite pleased with their references, but they listed like 22 reasons why Britons feel guilt, and I think one of the top things there was like not calling people who are close to you, or yeah, some other things as well. But so I hope that these examples sound familiar or are easy to relate to people's like ordinary lives. So yeah, if you're not maybe calling your parents often enough, or also when you're procrastinating and delaying things, doing something else instead of the thing that you should be doing. This too is a kind of omission. And what is really interesting about those instances of guilt is that, I mean, if earlier we looked at those cases of guilt that really have this kind of tragic sense of irreversibility, then this is not the case at all here, or at least it need not be the case. Because there could just be this kind of constant nagging awareness that you are in the wrong unless you do something about it. I mean, of course, in some cases you can think that, oh, I have lost valuable time and I will never get that time back. But I mean, this need not be the case. In many cases, for example, when you're just procrastinating, I mean, you can just, the guilt will, you can finish the guilt if you actually start doing the thing that you should be doing. So there doesn't need to be this tragic sense of irreversibility. there. So in that sense, I think that this kind of omission guilt has a very different phenomenology from this really tragic retrospective action guilt. And we should take it into account when we try to give like general characterizations of guilt, because there are very many different kinds of phenomenologies there. Also, and this is actually a controversial point now, I think that it is perfectly possible to feel guilt for traits and dispositions. It tends to be a very common assumption that guilt is something that you feel for deeds, and shame is something that you feel for your character traits or dispositions. But let us just look at some examples. Patricia Greenspan, for example, has suggested that when you're not very bright and ambitious, but this is what your parents wanted you to be, then you can feel that you're letting your parents down, and this can elicit a kind of guilt. And this would be a kind of character guilt, because it's not about a specific thing that you do, but it's about who you are. Well, this might not always be like, maybe people shouldn't feel that kind of guilt. I also have a different kind of example. For example, imagine in the context of like romantic relationships, where somebody is not empathetic and sensitive enough to the other person's needs, and this can lead to arguments. And I mean, taken in isolation, all these little kinds of instances, you might be able to find excuses that you were really tired that day. But what might really lie behind all that might still be this more general tendency to overlook another person's needs. And this is also why the other person might get mad at you, because not because of the single act, but because of the more general tendency that it reflects. And here too, I mean, quite directly, you are letting the other person down. And I think this is really what accounts for the guilt. Of course, for traits, you can feel shame as well. But yeah, I think that the crucial thing is that you feel that you're letting the other person down by what you are. And then, of course, states as well, like survivor guilt for being alive and enjoying life's pleasures, which has also sometimes been characterized as a rather bittersweet thing, but in a more sad sense than these little giving in to temptation kind of situations, and or the so-called Scandinavian guilt for being rich and well off, especially felt when you walk past a beggar or something like that. So, yeah, when we move past actions and when we look at omissions, traits, states, then it becomes much more visible that we can have long-standing episodes of present-focused guilt as well. I want to go even a bit further, and I want to say that some forms of guilt are actually their strongest in the present-focused form. And I think that this case of procrastination guilt is a really good example, because as I said, once you quit procrastinating, you don't have to feel guilt as intense as before. I mean, you can, of course, still be guilty that you did procrastinate, but you have already done something to compensate for it, right? And this is very different. Like when you think about a murderer committing a murder, the murder is done, and he's not committing a murder anymore. There is no inherent compensation there. So there is no reason to feel like less guilty after the action has been completed. So yeah, some types of guilt can be really like the strongest in the present-focused form, which is, I think, something that has been overlooked by many conceptions of guilt, because we always tend to think about it in a kind of like past-focused form, and sometimes it's thought that like as the time goes on and you really realize the full gravity of the wrong, then you kind of feel more guilt. Though, of course, in those cases too, maybe you should feel guilty, of course, earlier. But here, I'm saying that you have the most reason to feel most intensively guilty while you're doing it. So, So, yeah, let us now move on to future-focused guilt, because I think that this is going to be more controversial than those cases of present-focused guilt, which are very familiar from our ordinary lives. And I'm going to start with a few examples. I've been trying to quit that, bringing up that example of Abraham and Isaac, but I'm going to bring it up again today, because there is something about it that I think is good. And I'm not appealing to like how the story is originally told. I'm just inviting you to think about a version of Abraham who is told by God that he has to sacrifice his son. But I mean, it would make sense that he doesn't want to sacrifice his son. Any parent kind of doesn't want to like inflict suffering on their children. So I think that in this case, it would be possible that like if Abraham knows in advance, he makes up his mind, he knows that he's not going to disobey God, he's going to sacrifice the son, he might already feel guilty for sacrificing the son, because he has made up his mind that he will do that in the future. Also, something that I have felt, when ending a relationship, you have already made up your mind, you know that you're going to end the relationship, you know that this is going to cause suffering for the other person, and you can already feel guilty in advance, because you know that you are going to do it. Then also, perhaps let's take the fictional Gauguin, who is going to abandon his family. He's going to move to Tahiti, and he's planning to do great art there. And like, let's imagine that he has already arranged the travel and knows how to get there, and he already has a ticket to a ship, or I don't know, whatever Gauguin would have used to commute there. Then too, I think that in principle, he could already feel guilty about it, even though he has not yet done the deed. These again are more tragic cases, like especially the case of Abraham and Isaac. But I think that, yeah, it's probably related to the kind of like that you have this really pointed like action. We're not dealing with those omissions here anymore, and sometimes these actions can be quite tragic, but not necessarily, of course, in all cases, especially in cases of these tragic dilemmas where you have one moral value competing with the other moral value. And that's why I think that the Abraham and Isaac case is good, because he feels it as a moral obligation to obey to God, and he also feels it as a moral obligation to not inflict suffering on his child. So these cases can be like quite tragic. Yeah, here's a picture of Abraham taking Isaac to the mountain. So I want to say that these are all cases where you could, in principle, feel this future-focused guilt. And maybe some people are already convinced by these examples, and it seems quite intuitive that you could feel so. But I'm also going to back it up with more general defense. And here I want to tell you about a very classic way of differentiating between two groups of emotions. It was more popular in the ancient times and in medieval times, not so much nowadays anymore, but nevertheless, we can imagine two groups of emotions. One is backward-looking emotions. Common examples have usually been joy, sadness, and the so-called forward-looking emotions. Common examples, hope and fear. I'm using the labels backward and forward-looking because this is how they have been traditionally called, but I kind of, I only use those words in brackets. And of course, one might think that it's the temporal orientation that differentiates, because when we feel fear, when we hope, we think about things in the future normally, and normally we are also glad and sad about the things that have kind of happened. But I think that there are actually really good reasons to think that this is not, the temporal orientation is not really the best criterion to kind of make this distinction. Because, and this is also pointed out by philosophers like Robert Gordon and also some others, actually a better criterion is perceived certainty and uncertainty. Perhaps it would be useful here to think about a few examples, because this is how this argument is normally made, that authors appeal to like different examples, and where we see that the temporal orientation is different, but the certainty uncertainty criterion nevertheless works. So let's take a few examples. A conductor, for example, who knows in advance that the train will arrive late could feel joy or sadness, because this might relate to avoiding like congestion at the terminal, right? This is an example by Robert Gordon. Also, William Lyons has said that a mother could be sad and grieve over the loss of her son when the son has been sentenced to death. Like, again, we have a case of like a future event, but we have already we already believe that it will take place. So the temporal criterion does not work, but the perceived certainty is there. So really what's crucial is that you need to believe that the event will take place. And maybe furthermore, I would like to appeal to this analogy with like sadness. So, I mean, all in all, I want to say that guilt too belongs to this former category of emotions that traditionally called backward-looking emotions like joy and sadness, rather than hope and fear, right? Because like intuitively, when we think about guilt, I mean, it's more akin to sadness than to kind of fear. Of course, there might be different fears related to guilt, but guilt itself is a kind of like, you are kind of sad that you did the kind of thing. So, I mean, I think that guilt clearly belongs to this traditionally backward-looking emotions, to this category. And, I mean, these emotions belonging to this backward-looking category, or the emotions of perceived certainty category, I mean, structurally, they are all similar. They are effective ways of being directed at some believed state of affairs, which is their intentional object. Of course, you can be directed into all kinds of intentional objects, regardless of whether they are in the past or whether they are in the future. So, when we think about this analogy with sadness, then in case of sadness, I mean, it's easy to think about cases of being sad about the future. Like, you know that due to global warming, life is going to be a disaster on Earth at some point, and you might be sincerely sad about it. So there is no kind of like restriction there. And since these emotions, guilt and sadness, they are structurally similar, there are no restrictions to like thinking about sadness or thinking about guilt as focused on the future either. I mean, of course, there are differences between these two emotions, between guilt and sadness. For example, they have a different shape. Sadness has a very general kind of shape. It's a kind of negative evaluation of the state of affairs. In case of guilt, we are talking about a kind of negative moral evaluation of the state of affairs where you are contributing to, or where you are involved, and you perceive yourself as bringing about some immoral state. But this kind of difference in the scope, I think that it only makes us easier to like understand why it's not that hard for us to imagine those cases of future-focused sadness, because the scope of the emotion is so much wider. I mean, you just need to negatively evaluate something, whereas in case of guilt, you have to give a negative moral evaluation to your deed, right? So I think that this just accounts for how frequently we feel these different emotions, but this difference in scope is no reason for thinking that guilt could not be focused on the future. Also, one might say that there's a self-reflective element in case of guilt, and that's why it can't be focused on the future. But I mean, let's imagine a case of self-reflective sadness. You might be sad that one day you are going to die. So I don't think that the self-reflective element is going to make any difference here, because in case of future focused guilt too, you can imagine a state where you are involved in the future, right? So the self-reflective element, I don't think, is really relevant either. And yeah, I think that once you agree that guilt belongs to this category of backward, or like the emotions of perceived certainty, and that when you also agree that sadness as an emotion of perceived certainty can be focused on any of the temporal dimensions, then since there is an analogy between the two emotions and they belong to the same general category, there isn't really any reason to think why one cannot be focused on the future and the other can. So yeah, here I have another little diagram here that simply you need to have this belief that you will do something in the future, and then this belief occasions the kind of guilt. I do not want to imply that they must be very far off in time. They can be there quite simultaneously, this belief or a belief-like state, that in the occurrence of this future action. But yeah, basically this belief is this crucial element there, because there might be many cases, for example, let's take this bank robber again, who is planning to rob a bank, but he's not very sure whether he's going to be successful, right? I don't think that he's going to feel this truly future-focused guilt. He might feel guilt that he's the kind of person who's going to rob a bank and he has a kind of intention to do it, but since he doesn't believe yet that this will be successful, then there is no reason to feel this truly future-focused guilt. But all those cases that I told you, like the case when you know that you're going to break up with somebody, when you're Abraham and you know that you're going to sacrifice your son, then these cases are slightly different because this belief is there. Of course, some people might still want to say that perhaps this kind of future-focused guilt is still reducible to present-focused guilt or to past-focused guilt. Now, first, what I want to say, I think that these kind of reductionist strategies are question-begging, because I think that someone who is skeptical about future-focused guilt should first give a reason and to say why we cannot look guilt as analogical to sadness. So I think that the burden of proof is really there on their side to kind of show us a reason why we should be skeptical in the first place. So yeah, I think that these strategies, reductionist strategies, are question-begging, but let us go through some of them. And perhaps we'll see that some of those strategies are not very convincing anyway. So there are two types of strategies. One might say that actually you just feel past or present focused guilt within a simulated scenario. And the other is that the intentional object is already existent in the present. You feel guilt for your character or intention. So let's look at the first strategy. Can we really say that this so-called future-focused guilt that Abraham feels for soon, like engaging in the sacrifice, is it really mere simulation guilt? Is it merely due to the fact that Abraham is simulating in his mind what he's doing? I don't think so. First, because I don't think that simulation is really necessary for truly future-focused guilt. I mean, Abraham can feel guilt even if he's not constantly simulating the situation. In fact, he might be very reluctant to simulate it, but nevertheless, he would be walking around all day with a very heavy heart and with a very heavy conscience, even if he's not simulating that. Also, I don't think that the simulation could be sufficient to account for truly future-focused guilt, because, I mean, conducting a mere thought experiment, when you don't really think that anything is going to actually happen, this is not going to give us so intense guilt feelings and so persistent guilt feelings. I mean, if Abraham would just imagine the sacrifice without actually believing that this is what will take place, then of course he might feel some guilt, but this is not going to be a guilt as strong as in this real scenario. And this is because he's not just conducting a thought experiment, he's involved in a real situation where he will commit, and he knows, or at least where he believes that he will commit the kind of deed that he wouldn't want to. So I don't think that the simulation strategy is the best strategy where we could really reduce this future-focused guilt to mere simulation. But there is also a different reductionist strategy, and basically one could say that the person is feeling character guilt instead. He's feeling guilt for the current character. For example, Anthony Steinbock says that the person might think that I am this person who cheats or who will steal without having done so-and-so before, and I experience this as possible for me. I think that in case of this, when we think about Abraham, there need not be anything wrong with his character, or any person who is involved in a tragic dilemma. You could also imagine Sophie's choice, where Sophie was confronted by a Nazi officer and had to give away one of her babies and had to choose it herself. And I mean, in those cases, I don't think it doesn't reduce to the character of the person, because there need not be anything wrong with the person's character. I mean, of course, maybe someone could try to push the point and say that, oh, you realize this potential in you to do horrible things, to sacrifice your son. But this kind of potential, I mean, if we have read or we know more about those tragic dilemmas, then many of us should know that this kind of potential might be in us, that in really difficult cases where we only have two very bad options when we are going to do something bad. But again, I mean, this kind of potential is going to stay within Abraham also later. When the messenger comes from God and says that actually you don't have to sacrifice your son, I mean, Abraham himself would still know that this potential is in him to go through with the sacrifice, but he wouldn't feel guilty anymore because he doesn't believe that he will actually do it. So again, there is going to be this kind of difference in the intensity there. So it can't be merely guilt about the potential. But the most difficult reductionist strategy to counter is actually one that reduces it not to a character guilt, but to intention guilt. And this is really tricky because in case of when I told you about simulation guilt, I told you how simulation and this future-focused guilt can come apart. I cannot do this with intention because it's very difficult to bring you in cases where you have no intention, but you believe that you are going to do something. Maybe someone who believes in an oracle and he's told by an oracle that he's going to do something. Maybe this kind of person could feel this future-focused guilt, but I mean, this is such a rare and exotic example. I don't think that we have very stable intuitions about what the person would feel in this kind of situation. And of course, this person would really very sincerely have to believe the oracle. So, but I don't want to appeal to these kinds of cases. I think that these are so rare cases that we don't have reliable intuitions about them. So I think that in most cases, this future-focused guilt is going to be mixed with the intention guilt. Yeah, I think that the intention guilt will be there. So this kind of guilt will have, it will be partly focused on the present, your present intention, but in your mind you have already betrayed the person. But I still want to say that it also has this future-focused aspect as well. And I think it becomes more visible, perhaps, in retrospective cases, because after the sacrifice was called off, then Abraham could still feel guilty that he had this kind of intention to go through with it. So this too could be a kind of like intention guilt, but it wouldn't be as intense because, again, we don't have a belief in the occurrence of the actual sacrifice. And I mean, maybe not all of you are going to be pleased with this, but with this strategy, but I really don't think that there is any other way of showing it rather than appealing to this kind of retrospective comparison. But if you're not pleased with this example, then again, I would appeal to the fact that the reductionist strategies themselves are question-begging. And a person who's skeptical about future-focused guilt should first say why guilt is different from sadness, that we cannot imagine like these kinds of cases. So without this kind of reason, I don't think that it makes much sense to opt for a reductionist strategy as well. So here I would just play with the burden of proof. In fact, partly I also think that the person who would only feel guilt for the intention, I think that there would be something, and this is perhaps a more speculative point, I think there would be something maybe morally weird about it, because this kind of person would have to be maybe a person would really have to think that like the only true object of guilt is like your current mental state, not what actually happens, but at least in real life, many people do think that you should feel guilt for like what actually happens as well, not just about your own mental state. So it might be quite weird to feel this intention guilt, but not really care about like what actually is going to happen. So there might be even reasons to think that it's kind of morally obligatory in those cases to feel this kind of future-focused guilt. Very briefly, also a few words about like the phenomenological uniqueness of future-focused guilt. As already said earlier, I think that this tragic sensation is often going to be there, similarly to retrospective cases. But I think that it's interesting to compare this future-focused guilt with past-focused guilt, because then we can see some characteristics of guilt in a more general way, and it helps to put these things that are often said about retrospective guilt into a more wider perspective. So the tragic sensation here is not really about the irreversibility of time, that I can't turn back time and do things differently. Rather, in those cases, you feel guilt because you're trapped in circumstances that do not allow you to uphold all your loyalties or to translate all your values into action. So what is common here is really that the situation cannot be changed, either because it's in the past or because the situations at the moment are such that you just can't or you won't do otherwise. So this highlights actually guilt as an emotion of certainty. Yeah, we shouldn't only talk about this tragic sensation in relation to irreversibility of time, but it's a more general thing. Also an interesting thing, this is also emphasized by Anthony Steinbock, who's very skeptical about the future-focused guilt, and he says that this guilt we can imagine guilt even if you have this really weird temporal experience where you can't where future is kind of closed down for you. You could still imagine people feeling guilt, and that sometimes guilt itself could close this future down for you because there is some horrible deed in your past and you're so focused on it that just you can't think about your future. Now, since I hope that I've given reasons to think that you can have this future-focused guilt, then I would say that actually it can also be the other way around. Abraham, who knows that he will soon lay his knife on his son, for him, all his past might be broken down or closed down because there is this one event that is waiting for him in the future. And the more general characteristic here, what I think that it highlights is actually that the gravitating force of emotions, especially negative emotions, that emotions and the objects of emotions, they really draw our attention to them. And why I really want to highlight the negative emotions part is because positive emotions, sometimes I think they have they can at least have a kind of freeing potential. That if something good has happened, then now you can move on with things. You can move on with your life. You don't need to be focused on the good thing that happened. It gives you a kind of confidence. But with negative emotions, I think it's different. It doesn't free you from anything. It rather ties you to the negative event and absorbs your mind. So, yeah, I think that the consideration of future-focused guilt better helps us see these more general characteristics that lie behind these little things that are sometimes emphasized when people talk about past-focused guilt. And last but not least, as I also said, I want to go back to retrospective guilt. And I want to ask first, why do people mainly talk about retrospective guilt, and is this really bad that they talk about it? So, of course, in one sense, all other types of guilt will eventually become retrospective because once the deed is over, the guilt will have to become retrospective. But perhaps one of the reasons also why many people in this Carson and Schuberg's study talked about retrospective guilt might be that it has a special mnemonic function. Because when you didn't realize the full gravity of the wrong, then it really makes sense for you to kind of save this incident in your mind, and guilt kind of helps to do it. But if you are involved in a tragic dilemma, there isn't much to learn about that that would help us in the future, because I mean it's going to be very difficult to kind of stay clear from those really difficult circumstances. So perhaps this retrospective guilt has really a special mnemonic function. It helps us remember the things that we didn't realize were bad at the time when we did them. And is it really bad that we talk so much about retrospective guilt, or that retrospective guilt is so prevalent? Well, I think that if we try to imagine a world where we would feel more present and future-focused guilt, then it would be a bit sad to imagine this kind of world, because it would either indicate that we ourselves would have an internal conflict and we would need to have this weakness of will, or the world itself would have to be a rather hostile place that sets those really tragic dilemmas in our way. Or maybe also it could be an indicator of people having too many commitments. But if you have so many commitments, you care about so many people, you can't always be there for all of them. But the dominance of exclusively past-focused guilt, this mainly just indicates the kind of ignorance that you didn't realize how wrong bad the thing was. And perhaps, though I'm not certain, maybe this ignorance is easier to kind of tackle with than these hostile circumstances of the world. So perhaps it is not that bad after all, that most of the time we are burdened with past-focused guilt.
So, thank you very much for a tremendous talk. We've got 10-15 minutes for questions. Ralph? Do we need
I'll carry it round after I ask my question. Thanks very much, Heidy. That was such an interesting talk, and it had the qualities some interesting talks have that, irritatingly, at sort of 4 or 5 points, I thought, aha, now I've got a really good question. And then you answered it. I thought, oh, well, that deals entirely with my clever idea. I was really interested at the end when you were just talking a little about the mnemonic role of guilt, partly because I have some Buddhist friends who talk a lot about the ideal of being able to be serene in the face of everything. And I've always found that very appealing. And just the other day, I was thinking about how I'd arranged something in a stupid way, and I was thinking, oh God, why did I do that? And it occurred to me, if I felt serene about this, I'd just go and do it again and again. And maybe it's good that I'm feeling this agony over what I've done. But my question is, so, and you did address this to some degree towards the end, the distinction between intention guilt and future focus guilt. I understand the distinction, and I can see, I think, the structure of your argument for thinking there really is future-focused guilt as well. But I'm wondering what our story is about what happens when, to begin with, your bank robber, your potential bank robber or whoever, is merely contemplating a future action, and they already feel a certain degree of guilt, which is presumably focused on their present contemplation. They feel a bit bad about seriously contemplating this thing.
Okay, yeah.
And then, they realize they're even more hard up for cash than they were, and they start to form something more approaching an intention, and finally belief that they're going to perform this action. Over the course of that development, it sounds like not only must the intensity of their guilt increase, but its intentional object has to subtly shift from their current contemplation to their future action.
Yeah.
And so I just wondered if you had anything to say about how that happens, whether that shows up phenomenologically, if it doesn't, why we don't notice it.
Right. I mean, I do believe that in great extent this is going to be a rather gradual kind of shift, because first you are just contemplating on doing it, but I think that when the moment you form a really strong intention, this will be accompanied by the belief that you will do it, if it is a very strong kind of intention. Because otherwise you intend to try doing it, right? Then this belief comes with the intention, and while, I mean, I think that this intention guilt grows out from this contemplation. I mean, you're earlier guilty about contemplating, now you're guilty about intention. But now this belief comes up that you will actually do it. And this will add this element of future focused guilt there as well. And I mean, this is going to, I think it's going to add much to the persistency of guilt, because you kind of now you know that you are going to do it. But of course, like phenomenologically, it's probably not going to be like a really poof, like pow, here's future focused guilt as well, because this people form intentions kind of gradually, like versus way that leads up to it.
Thank you. I won't follow up at length, but it just occurred to me, maybe it would be interesting to think about it in terms of Bayesian degrees of credence, as opposed to just belief and disbelief, because then you could have a gradual increase. But we should know. Charles.
Thank you. It's very, very interesting. I'm grappling to understand what you're talking about. As someone who feels guilty about everything, obviously. But I feel that, imagine you've got a lot of stuff when you're going on holiday and you're trying to pack a suitcase, and you simply have too much for the suitcase. It just will not go in, however you fold it, right? What seems to be going on here is, generally speaking, a space between what is the right thing to do and something that isn't that, and you're feeling bad that you're in that space.
How was that related to the suitcase?
Well, I'll tell you, because imagine there was a language where you had a word for being in that space in the past, which is pilt. Okay. And you have a word for being in that space in the present, which is prilt. And you have a space for being in that space in the future, which is filt. And you have a word for being in that space where you might do something, which is milt. Okay. And you have a space for being where you could do something, which is kilt when you're in Scotland. So if you had those words for these states, would this problem go away? In other words, are we having this discussion simply because the word guilt is not big enough to push everything into it? Or is it a real problem?
Okay, well, I imagine that maybe indeed some people might be tempted to use a different kind of word for this future-focused guilt. But I don't think that there is a good reason for that, because when we think about what emotions generally are, and as I said, they are effective ways of being directed at certain object. Different emotion theories are going to put it differently. Some say that they are cognitions, some say that they are appraisals, some say that they are perceptions in a more metaphorical kind of sense, but none of those states is restricted to only one temporal dimension. So you can, like in case of sadness, you can be effectively and I mean, what individuates emotions, I mean, this was a thing common to all emotions, or at least this is what all the emotion theories would kind of say. And none of those states are restricted to one temporal dimension. But now what's supposed to individuate emotions and make them unique is supposed to be the shape. And this is often cast in terms of this kind of evaluation that is at the core of the emotion. So, like in case of sadness, it's evaluating something negatively, very generally. In case of guilt, it's a kind of negative evaluation of your deed, right? So here too, I mean, we can see that there is structurally, these past and future-focused instances are going to be similar, because in both cases you are effectively directed at a state of affairs where you do something wrong or where you have done something wrong. So when you look at the basic structure of the emotion, then this is going to be the same. There is no additional or different kind of elements. Simply in one case, the believed state of affairs is in the past, and in the other case, it's in the future. But when we feel sadness, we don't have different kinds of words for retrospective sadness and future-focused sadness. So again, my question would be, why would we want to use different kinds of words in case of guilt? And I don't think that there is a good reason for it. I think that we are simply, since those cases are going to be a bit more rare, because we don't always find ourselves from these hostile situations or these kinds of dilemmas, when we are not used to using this word guilt for the future-focused situations. But this is no reason for saying that we are not dealing with the same kind of emotional or affective phenomenon. So it still has exactly the same structure. So this is why I think that we shouldn't just go for calling it by some other kind of name.
Maria was actually.
Hi, thank you for your talk. And on regard to that question and your answer, I was thinking when you explained the Abraham situation that the future guilt, in terms of naming as guilt, may be easily understood, perhaps, I don't know, it's just like a question as well. Mm-hmm. If we distinguish between the act itself and the consequences of the act, because perhaps Abraham feels guilty for the act of deciding to kill, mm-hmm. and he has fear in the future for the consequence of his actual decision. You know what I mean?
I don't think so, because I think that I mean, fear is related to uncertainty, but you don't know what is going to happen. But if you know what you're going to happen, he knows that he's going to like lay his knife on his son. Then of course he might be afraid that he will feel very sad. But I mean, he still believes that he's going to do the thing. So I don't think that he's here only concerned about the deed as a consequence of the present intention. Maybe it's a bit hard to explain it, but like since he believes that, or maybe you could elaborate a bit more. I'm not sure if I'm getting your point correctly.
Perhaps the point is that like you are guilty, you feel guilty about something you do.
Okay.
And then when you think about the consequence of that act in the future,
okay,
you feel more guilty.
Okay.
But because of the fear of that consequence. In the sense of like, for example, perhaps you can feel guilty about deciding to do something now.
Okay.
And then the stance of like thinking about the consequences of your actual decision is like a different feeling, that it's more connected to fear and therefore a future feeling.
Okay, well, still I would say that I would go maybe back to this case of a bank robber who's decided to rob the bank, but if there is no belief there that he will like actually do it, then I think that the intensity of the guilt is going to be different. So he too can contemplate on the possible consequences that like he will actually rob the bank, but it's going to be a bit different, like because he doesn't yet know that this, he doesn't believe that this will be the case that he will necessarily succeed. So.
Yes, in that case could be the fear of going to jail perhaps increase the guilt of his deliberation.
Okay.
In some way.
Okay.
So I'm conscious that nearly everyone who's asked to pose a question is not going to be able to pose a question, but I think the two longest standing were this gentleman and we know each other. I can't remember your name. Anne. Anne.
Okay. And if we make them shortish questions,
Okay.
Perhaps if you ask them together and then.
Okay.
No, actually, I hate it when people do that. Ask them separately.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Is there any relationship between guilt and repentance?
Okay, that's a good question. I'm not sure if repentance is best categorized as an emotion, because it's also a more cognitive. I think that perhaps guilt is a part of the process of repentance, but I would rather view repentance as something more than just the feeling of guilt, where you kind of like contemplate about it more and you set different intentions for the future, or like I wouldn't categorize repentance as an emotion. So.
Mine is really in defense of Abraham,
Right.
because we can't even for a second forget that he was in direct relationship with God, and it was more of a test of hope and trust, which is the other side of your thing.
Yeah.
And so how can we imagine what that might have been like? But I take it that's not really where your emphasis is right now. My son here says the word dread might be the word that you're talking about some of the time when we dread something. But that's his. And that's it, really. The only other thing is that my main question is about imagined guilt. You know, from adverts, I don't have that car. There's no guilt. But we get guilty about it because we like that car in the advert and we don't get it. Okay. And I don't know how your what you've been saying relates to that situation.
so there were many questions there. First, you mentioned this dread. I think there might be dread there as well, but dread is a more general emotion that you can feel not only for your own actions, but also for other things. So I do not think that the dread would be specific enough to kind of capture what's going on when you know that you're going to sacrifice your son. And guilt is kind of better fitted for it because it involves this kind of negative moral evaluation of your own acts. Now, when it comes to those commercials where you feel guilty because you see like a fancy car and you know that you don't have it and you feel guilty about it. Okay, I have not felt it, but I can resonate with it because often commercials they try to elicit guilt in you that you're not a self-respecting person if you don't use this or that shampoo or like whatever. Like these guilt appeals in general are like very common. I think that these are quite standard cases of present-focused guilt because they elicit guilt about like your current omission or like you not having the car, you not using the best shampoo or like so perhaps this is a way that we could conceive them.
Present rather than future, I suppose.
Yeah.
Right, alas, this is all we have time for, but there'll be a little bit of time to pose questions over drinks now. We do, let's see, we should just say the next talk we're going to have is in February 20...
Check the website. I think
Check the website.
Yeah.
Mark Hocknell on
Evil.
Evil.
And the myths we live by.
And the myths we live by.
There's also be a book launch on the 14th of February. Also be a book launch on 14th of February at the Mathematical Institute for the new Ian Ramsey Centre series on science and religion. And the former IDRIOS chair, Peter Harris, will be coming from Australia for that. And the present IDRIOS chair will be speaking as well. And it'll be quite a big event. So 14th of February, do look at the website. Thank you.
So many tremendous things to look forward to. And but in the meantime, if we could just give another thank you.